Welcome. Today, we're going to talk about the biology of stress, how nutrition and functional medicine can help. I'm really excited to share some of this cutting edge information with you. A lot of it influenced by my training with the Institute of Functional Medicine, thinking about some new interventions that can be helpful to people. I do want to just quickly say that we're going to talk about trauma today and adversity, adverse childhood experiences, and that stress, trauma, and adversity are not necessarily synonyms. They're not the same thing, okay? There's a lot of overlap in the biology, but there's a little bit of lumping going on today just for the sake of making points. I'll do some splitting and some discerning because that's my gift to the world, but there will be some other terms. But broadly speaking, we're talking about stress. I have no corporate conflicts of interest related to this presentation, and here I am. Hopefully you've already found me on social media, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok. All my papers are on Google Scholar. I am an Institute of Functional Medicine certified practitioner. I'm also the founder of the Wise Mind Nutrition app. Please check that out if you haven't already. There's a lot of exciting new developments in that area. My doctorate is from UCLA. I studied public health and health psychology, and I did a lot of research on adverse childhood experiences and how they affect biology and mental health over the lifespan. My private practice is nutrition and recovery, and I'm from Los Angeles. And there I am in 1991 at the bottom right corner. Today, we're going to start with some introductory material covering the biological foundations. We're going to talk about food, eating, and stress, and we will get into interventions. I've always sort of offered nutrition interventions, and today I'm going to go much broader and offer many other ideas, levers that you can pull to improve your mental health journey and that of your patients and clients. To kick it off, what is stress? Of course, it's important to discern between acute and chronic stress. Acute is more of an immediate response, an adaptive response that needs to happen to almost put out a fire, whereas chronic stress can more so develop over time and leave a legacy and become maladaptive. And so that's an important discernment. Of course, there are growth-promoting forms of stress. Eustress, maybe you've heard the term hormetic stress. If you think about holding a yoga position like a plank with one arm, right? That's a stressful situation. But in doing so, in exposing yourself to eustress, your body's learning how to navigate that type of a situation better versus distress, which is leaving a damaging biological legacy, which we're going to talk about today. There's a term, homeostasis, which describes balance, and allostasis, which describes all the physiological processes which help move someone toward homeostasis. When I was doing my research on ACEs, I learned about allostatic load. It is an index of different lab values across cardiometabolic, neurohormonal, immunal labs, and it looks at how the accumulation of load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body. Okay, so it's not just looking at a single biomarker, but an index, like maybe 10. There's a couple different definitions, but it's a much more nuanced way to think about the biology of stress. So it's not saying, let's just look at this one acute marker of inflammation. Let's look at a collection of them and see where there are signals showing up, per se. It turns out that those with many ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, have higher allostatic load. They're more likely to carry the biological embedding of adversity, and it leaves a lasting signature on inflammation, metabolism, brain, etc. Adverse childhood experiences are things like household dysfunction, parents fighting, divorce, substance use, and also childhood maltreatment, as well as things that can be experienced in the community, bullying, denigration, other challenges at school, the neighborhood, etc. And I think if I were to just summarize real briefly, people that have ACEs, a lot more ACEs, tend to be more susceptible to stressors through the lifespan. And what that means is that they're more likely to endure the cumulative wear and tear on the body systems. So the mechanism of the human stress response is by way of the HPA axis, starting at the hypothalamus in the brain, and it releases a hormone, a cortico-releasing hormone. And that goes to the pituitary to signal another hormone called ACTH to signal the adrenal to release cortisol and DHEA. This is linked to the 4 Fs, the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses. And it's also very critical for cortisol rhythm. I've been doing this type of lab testing now for a couple years, and being able to see people's cortisol curves through like a 4-point salivary analysis. It's supposed to start off higher and get lower throughout the day. And this gives a lot of insights into the body's stress response. There is a thing called glucocorticoid resistance. You've heard of insulin resistance or perhaps leptin resistance. Similar thing can happen when cortisol is in the body a lot over time. Cells can stop responding to these signals, and you can reach some burnout stages. In the beginning, cortisol and the HPA axis is hyper responsive, eventually becomes hypo-responsive. And that's when you see what some people call quote unquote adrenal fatigue, which is a controversial term, but it's HPA axis dysfunction. That's the language that I tend to use. And it is important to think contextually about how early life stress could potentially have set up this cascade over the lifespan. Now, of course, people say, well, if I have a lot of ACEs or a lot of early life developmental trauma, there's not much that I can do about it. And there are things that can be done in the space of recovery healing. And it's also really important to know where some of the biological dysfunction comes from. I've helped a lot of people just connect the dots. Basically, that's what we do in functional medicine. You take the whole story, the biopsychosocial timeline, get all the adversity, all the medical stuff, get a really clear picture of someone's relationships in their life, relationship with food and body, infections, weight changes, and create this incredible timeline. And then start connecting some of the dots, right? And if you do really awesome specialty lab testing, the tests that I offer can help connect some of these dots, and you could tell a biological story back and have it match your personal recall. It's a very powerful process. So stress gets under the skin by way of molecular mechanisms. There are periods in development where things could be a lot more damaging or a heightened impact per se. These are known as critical or sensitive periods, times during developmental plasticity where things are more likely to leave a legacy. And then, of course, the epigenetic modifications. This is a really fascinating and fast-growing area of science. The one that I've looked the most into is the NR3C1, which is the glucocorticoid receptor gene. If you think about it, okay, we've got a person exposed to developmental trauma, and they've got immune activation, HPA axis dysfunction. Cortisol is circulating perhaps more than it would otherwise, for someone else. Eventually, it feeds back to the brain, okay? So in the hypothalamus, there are these receptors. Eventually, it can get a signal, okay, this is a lot. We need to downregulate. And this is through a process known as methylation. There's other epigenetic modifications through histone modification, acetylation, etc. But epigenetics captures the biological embedding of stress, probably in the most pronounced ways. There are other genes per se. FKBP5 is related to the glucocorticoid receptor gene. Of course, we know there's a strong link to trauma, stress, adversity, and addictions, and that can come through opioid receptors by way of the reward system. And we know that stress, trauma, and adversity could be transmitted generationally. And this isn't about willpower, it's about biology being shaped by experience. So those that have had a fair share of stress usually can be classified as having a pro-inflammatory phenotype where, this chronic stressors primes the immune system toward inflammation. And there's measurable biomarkers, things like IL-6, IL-1 beta, TNF alpha, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. There's tests that we can do to look at these, but of course we want to dig deeper and look at the context of it all. We now know that when inflammation is persistent, it can affect the brain. This is known as leaky brain or Permeability at the level of the blood-brain barrier. It's a really hot topic, especially when it comes to neurodegenerative diseases. When you think about Alzheimer's, dementia, et cetera, like, what's the mechanism? I believe that the blood-brain barrier is telling a big and important part of that story. And the immune system is the signaling, whether it be cytokines or otherwise. There's immune molecules circulating, taking the temperature, sending signals. And at the brain, there's microglia, astrocytes, and it's sending messages to the brain that affect our mental health. It is very likely that there is inflammation happening in the brain that we haven't fully captured yet. I've seen some data about inflammation in the amygdala. But yes, with cumulative biomarkers, as we see in allostatic load, we're seeing data to suggest a faster cognitive and physical decline. And when it comes to mental health, a really important thing to think about is how this immune activation, this psychoneuroimmunology can lead to less inhibitory control. So it makes a person more disinhibited, more likely to take risks or have an inability to weigh the pros and cons of a situation. And this is what's most characterized by addictions and eating behaviors, etc. With chronic stress, we know that hippocampal volume can decrease. This is a part of the brain that's mostly involved in memory as well as some other things. But it makes sense if someone's deeply traumatized and has ongoing stress that they would store less of that. There's a survival mechanism to encode that information and send it somewhere. The prefrontal cortex is compromised. There's data to suggest thinning, overall gray matter is down. Connectivity across the amygdala is up. The amygdala is responsible for emotional reactivity, cravings, anxiety, depression, and also the vigilance to threats. So with trauma and with chronic stress, and again, I started with, in this conversation, it's not super doable to tease them out, but it is true in both scenarios. A person is generally hypervigilant to threats, and that is largely influenced by the amygdala. The dopamine system is altered. We know that there's a mesolimbic dopaminergic projection that starts in the ventral tegmental area to the NAC. This is associated with salience, or the assignment of value. So it works with the hippocampus to remember things that are very rewarding. So if you think about it, someone has a lot of stressors and they use a substance or eat a food that makes some of that go away temporarily. The brain will assign more value to that substance because it's not just rewarding, but the reward also decreased the negative affect. Okay. And this is the stress addiction link, which is super, super important. The brain will learn that the substance makes this issue dissipate in the short term. So it equates it with survival and it assigns it more value. And that's how addictions tend to develop over time. The prefrontal cortex is compromised. This is the part of the brain that can plan and control impulses, etc. And these are well-characterized, documented changes that are, shown both in animal models as well as human models. Okay. People have a blended response to reward predicting cues, and this can, of course, increase vulnerability to addictive disorders, including ultra-processed food use disorder. We also know about communication between the gut and the brain by way of the vagus nerve, immune, endocrine, and metabolic pathways. The gut to brain pathway is called the afferent, and the brain to gut is called the efferent. And sometimes those things are confused, but they're highways, and it is known to be bidirectional. We do know that there are some bacteria like Streptococcus and several others that produce inflammatory metabolites. We talked a little bit about leaky brain and how the process can start in the gut, intestinal permeability, and allow bacterial products like lipopolysaccharides into circulation, creating a vicious cycle where the stressors impact the gut, it impacts the composition of the blood, the immune system, brain inflammation, worsened mood, worsened anxiety, more stress, and the cycle continues. We know that microbes can influence food choices, and this is a very interesting area that I've been following closely. It's kind of spooky for a lot of people to think about how our choices can be influenced by our ecosystem, and that having certain types of bacteria can set up craving cascades for not only certain types of foods or sugars, but also drugs. There are bacteria that crave opioids. Really interesting stuff. I think it's an area that's moving a little slowly, but moving nonetheless. We do know that short chain fatty acids can cross the blood-brain barrier, modulate neurotransmission, and several bacterial metabolites are neurotransmitters, things like GABA, serotonin precursors, dopamine. We'll talk more about GABA and glutamate in a bit. I'm really fascinated by those two in particular because of their role in anxiety and the levers that we can pull to impact them. So stress dysregulates the gut, dysbiosis increases stress perception, and this stress-induced dysbiosis persists, maintains inflammation, and it alters the reward processing cascade, and this can be over the lifespan. This is a life course issue for many. We know that chronic stress and cortisol can impact mitochondrial function. And it makes sense, right? If you're getting this signal and it gets exhausting, eventually your body's not going to continue to produce energy the same way. It's going to say, wow, this is exhausting, and it's going to learn to shunt its resources elsewhere. So yes, chronic cortisol impairs mitochondrial efficiency. If there's oxidative stress, free radical damage, mitochondrial DNA is particularly vulnerable. This shows up as fatigue, brain fog, mood dysregulation, exercise intolerance. If you or clients of yours have a difficult time with exercise, it's telling a story about mitochondria. The nutrient demands increase. We know that stress depletes CoQ10, B vitamins, magnesium, and antioxidants. And there's times when we got to do testing, and there's also situations where you just know if someone doesn't have resources for specialty lab testing, that with ACEs, chronic stressors, anxiety, there's going to be some biological cascades that are somewhat predictable. So without adequate cellular energy, prefrontal cortex fails, impulsivity increases, someone makes poor food choices, leads to metabolic dysfunction, more cellular stress, and the cycle continues. So let's talk about food. Importantly, the assumption that I'm making here is that people stress eat. Of course, we know there are people that lose their appetite when stressed. Usually that person ends up getting their appetite back with a vengeance. The pendulum certainly does tend to swing. But broadly speaking, and it's funny, whenever I do it in a room and I ask like who gets appetite when stressed and who loses their appetite, it's usually about half and half. Most people tend to reach for something to make the stressors go away, but not everyone, okay? This is known as comfort food seeking, where palatable foods reduce cortisol, activate reward, and I described how the brain will assign that food more value than it otherwise would when it makes the stressors go away. This is known as hedonic eating, which is pleasure-driven that overrides hunger and satiety signals. Homeostatic eating is just balance, where if someone ate more than they should, their body would know what to do with it. This particular pathway overrides all of this. And there are mechanisms. There are appetitive neurons, NPY, AGRP, and these all act in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus. Ghrelin and leptin could be disrupted. Stress increases hunger hormones and decreases satiety hormones. The hormone picture is such a deep dive. Hopefully, a good place to start is leptin, insulin, and ghrelin. And from there, there's so many others. But once again, chronic stress changes sensitivity of reward in the brain, which makes highly palatable foods harder to resist. When we think about ultra-processed foods, we're rewiring the brain toward addiction-like circuitry. Neurobiological overlap with substance use disorders is crystal clear in the scientific literature. Same pathways, dopaminergic, the opioid system, as well as the GABA system and some cannabinoids. For reward deficiencies, a little bit controversial. There's been some really great genetic research in the space to look at particular deficiencies at the dopamine D2 receptor. I think it's good science, but again, genetic research sometimes doesn't land well on people, but I've been following RDS for about 10 years now, and I think there's something there. Of course, food addiction, highly evolved clinical construct that describes substance use disorder criteria basically in the context of food. We know that about 14% of people meet criteria for food addiction, and that closely mirrors substance use disorder. And we also know that those people tend to have more stress and more ACEs, more trauma, etc. So food addiction and other addictions are a rational neurobiological response to a dysfunctional reward system. It's shaped by stress and adversity and exploited by the engineered food supply. I've done a lot of research on ACEs and disordered eating. We know that more ACEs correlate with higher BMIs, eating disorders, ultra-processed food addiction. The question has always been like, what is the mechanism, right? Is it epigenetic changes? Is it HPA dysfunction, inflammation, changes in the brain, affective states, emotion dysregulation? And the answer is it's all interconnected. And most people have signs in a lot of these different mechanisms. It's starting to be mapped out in the literature. Of course, the specific types of ACEs matter. For example, emotional abuse and neglect are particularly linked to disordered eating. There are some gender differences. We know that there's some dose response data. Each additional ACE increases certain types of risk, and essentially that trauma, adversity, stressors, once again, not synonyms, create biological vulnerability that ultra-processed foods exploit. We also know that weight stigma is a chronic stressor and that it can activate the same stress pathways that I've described. Elevated cortisol, inflammation. There's also a known healthcare bias where a provider who carries a weight bias has been linked to worse health outcomes with their patients. When folks internalize the stigma, it perpetuates stress eating, and it's a paradoxical effect that people diet in the context of stress, and it tends to worsen outcomes rather than improve them. Weight stigma isn't just psychologically harmful, it's biologically harmful. And there are mechanisms that we've talked about today, and it's the same pathways, right? It creates the very stress that drives the eating behavior some are trying to change. So what are the known nutrient deficiencies? Magnesium, probably at the top of the list. It's involved in so many different biochemical reactions that we think of it as a bottleneck. Like if it's low, RBC magnesium low, there's going to be issues with recovery. It's critical for a really robust list of different needed biological processes involving the HPA. We have B vitamins, which are also involved cofactors in so many different things. Just to think about it this way, if there are these mechanisms at play, often what they're doing is utilizing these critical vitamins and minerals for these certain pathways rather than being able to utilize them for others. So chronic stress depletes B6, B12, folate. Cortisol production uses up vitamin C. Zinc is chronically low in stressed individuals. Omega-3 fatty acids are typically depleted in Western diets and stressed environments. They are also very anti-inflammatory. These are not optional nutrients. These are biological necessities. We also know that stressed individuals that eat ultra-processed foods get more inflammation from the foods that are consumed. These foods often have higher glycemic loads, industrial seed oils, additives. There could be food sensitivities that are activating the immune system. They could be IgG and it could be otherwise. There's a lot of other potential mediators with food sensitivity. But we know if there is issues at the mucosal barrier, the the lining starts to break down, there's intestinal permeability, there is more inflammation. And I do a lot of functional lab testing, and I do see this stuff quite a bit. And it's such an important thing to be able to recognize and to be able to start the healing process in phases, do it slow over time. It's not just about eating, an anti-inflammatory diet and taking a bunch of supplements. With specialty lab testing, you can really see what we need to focus on first, right? Neuroinflammation creates feedback. It signals the brain, increased anxiety, depression, and there is a vicious cycle. Stress, inflammatory eating, more inflammation, worse mood, more stress eating. Hopefully you've been able to see this cycle very clearly. Blood sugar is also important to think about in this context. There's a lot of easy devices now, CGMs that people are using. Some are pretty inexpensive and easily accessible and usable for 2 weeks. When there is a mental health journey and a lot of question marks, I think that this could be a pretty good lever to pull on just for some data, maybe just for 2 weeks. Of course, labs looking at glucose, A1C, insulin, etc. But broadly speaking, we know that highs and lows are characterized by erratic mood. And there is a way to stabilize blood sugar to help stabilize mood. There's a lot of data linking elevated A1C to depression. And that makes a lot of sense when you understand the mechanisms of insulin resistance, mitochondrial health, inflammation, all of the stuff we've talked about today. So definitely worth thinking about, particularly if there's afternoon crashes or 3 p.m. sugar cravings. Most people have heard the stat that 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut, but we also know that it requires precursors, amino acids, B vitamins, magnesium, a healthy gut biota. We know that dopamine requires amino acid precursors, but also requires other nutrients like iron, folate, B6, copper, vitamin C. GABA is actually made from glutamate, but they have some opposite action, okay? GABA is supposed to be calming, whereas glutamate's more excitatory, okay? So I've taken particular interest in GABA glutamate ratios, thinking about someone's anxiety that could be managed through understanding some of these mechanisms. There's urine tests that we can look at to look at neurotransmitter metabolites per se. But yes, for a lot of people, the ketogenic diet actually really improves mental health. And I've been very curious why. And I think one of the reasons is because it fixes a glutamate GABA ratio, decreasing glutamate, increasing GABA, reducing anxiety, and creating a clarity. Okay. And these are the kind of things that can be investigated, tested for in certain, like I said, functional lab tests, figuring out if there's a chemical imbalance that's actually real, using people that look at these types of labs on a regular basis to help connect the dots, connect it to your personal story, etc. So most people know what to eat. Most people are aware that the Mediterranean diet's helpful. You don't need me to tell you to eat more fruits, vegetables, high quality proteins, the right kinds of fats, thinking about intact grains if they work for you. There's a lot of evidence. And the question is why is it so difficult, right? There's cultural factors, values that people hold, a lot of reasons why there's a wide range of ways that people eat. Okay. So there isn't like a best practice, but it's pretty safe to say that eating real foods and minimizing exposure to ultra processed foods is going to be helpful no matter what the mental health presentation. And I would even argue that includes most eating disorders as well. But most people are just stressed out and life is hard and there's other competing factors and there's so many other reasons why we eat foods other than what are, designed to optimize our health. Omega-3 is generally something that most people don't get enough of. There's a lot of reasons to make an argument in favor of supplementation. Polyphenol-rich foods like berries, dark chocolate, green tea, turmeric, and of course, eliminating and reducing pro-inflammatory substances. Not being restrictive, thinking about what to add rather than what to remove. It might be worth looking into blood sugar stuff, at least emphasizing lower GI foods to prevent reactive hypoglycemia, including protein and fiber with each meal or snack to stabilize glucose and insulin, prevent reactive hypoglycemia, which is linked again to some of those hormonal cascades that are basically mimicking anxiety responses. With deliberate nutritional strategies, a lot can be done. A lot of people report significant changes in mood, anxiety symptoms, just from focusing on when to eat, eating anti-inflammatory foods, without even doing a lot of testing or supplemental protocols. CGMs, 14 days, not a terrible idea. I've seen it help a lot of people. We think about neurotransmitters and their precursors. It's important to remember that taking a precursor doesn't necessarily lead to the intended outcome, right? So sometimes someone could take tryptophan, which is the precursor for serotonin, and it doesn't actually go down a serotonin pathway. It goes down a kynurenine pathway, which can create quinolinic acid and other inflammatory molecules that weren't intended by the precursor. So it's not just what we take, but the terrain. And that's an important piece that a lot of folks miss. Given certain inflammatory environments or gut bacteria, ecosystems. So just taking a precursor doesn't necessarily create the intended effect. But if you do all the other things and you include the cofactors, it is safe to say that 5-HTP could be helpful for serotonin, tyrosine for dopamine. But again, you need the other factors. I've been doing a lot of genetic testing recently, and most people know that when there are certain variants, MTHFR, you need methylated versions of B vitamins, but there's nuance there. I've come across some situations where people have multiple genetic SNPs where there's even more attention required on the type of folate, for example, folinic acid. You got to just test and don't guess. That's what we say in functional medicine. Magnesium glycinate for the evenings. There's other forms of magnesium that are quite helpful. GABA support through direct GABA. L-theanine and taurine, I recommend quite a bit for GABA support. I think both of them are phenomenal supplements that I've also used personally. I've shared that I think some of my issues are related to GABA. I did a test 10 years ago and I learned that I don't have GABA producing bacteria. And it changed my life because I've always had some anxiety, and I realized there was a biological underpinning of my anxiety symptoms. And since that time, I'll tell you, I've had less anxiety because I just know that there are some levers that I can pull to improve that, but that some of it's just rooted in my genetic legacy, etc. Cofactors we've talked about, gotta include the minerals, things like iron, zinc, etc. You can't make neurotransmitters without raw materials. Maybe you've seen the 5R gut healing protocol through the Institute of Functional Medicine. It's not always required to do it in order, but there is an order. And I think removing things that are harmful is a really good place to start. Oftentimes we are replacing things that are missing, enzymes or stomach acid in the form of beta-ene HCl, doing a lot of work with HCl with folks that have been life-changing, thinking about specific probiotics to reintroduce prebiotics. Sometimes we repair the gut lining after reinoculation, sometimes a little earlier, but there's some really good supplements that can be helpful. And then, of course, the lifestyle stuff that we're going to get into next. Couple strains that are worth knowing about: L. rhamnosus, L. heviticus, Bifidobacterium longum, resistant starches, trying to really get 30 plus grams of fiber per day. I've seen some implications that with fermented foods, it's variety that matters. So using a lot of different sources rather than just the same one, that makes sense when we recommend rotating probiotics as well. Butyrate supplements, still a little controversial. I've seen it be helpful to folks. I've also seen it not, but there are levers that we can pull. There's things that we can try. Sometimes with testing and some trial and error, some very intentional protocols, you can really reverse some of the legacies that have been left from yesteryear, as I like to call it. There's a lot of mitochondrial supplement blends that have CoQ10 and PQQ, some of the niacin, NAD precursors, really good products out there that combine some things. Sometimes you want to get a combo product. Sometimes you want to really hone in on a specific nutrient. The best way to know is through testing, taking some of these with fat-containing meals. A big part of what I've been doing in the functional medicine space is helping people conceptualize protocols and spacing them out with empty stomach, meals, separating supplements, etc. It tends to really help when you have a clear roadmap, what I like to call a well-lit path. Maybe you've heard of adaptogens, things like ashwagandha, rhodiola. Some people say don't mix them, do them separately. Other people say they have to be blended. These are philosophical differences. And if you've been following me in my work, you know that I'm into the nuance and I don't pick sides. I want to learn from both sides of an argument and always figure out what makes sense and offer multiple options to my clients and patients and let them think about how to march forward. Holy basil, L-theanine, as I mentioned, phenomenal supplement, particularly for anxiety and the effects of chronic stress. Sometimes it takes 6 to 8 weeks to get the full effect. Herbs work through precise mechanisms. They're medicine. As we start wrapping up, there's just a couple other things worth knowing. And with my background in functional medicine, I've really tried to focus on some of these other areas where prioritizing sleep is at the top of the list. I'm not against low dose melatonin for short term. I've got modules on sleep hygiene in the Wise Mind Nutrition app. Most people are aware of these strategies. They're just hard to do. Okay. But if you see the labs and you feel the dysfunction and you have someone with confidence prescribe these interventions, they become much easier to do. Sleep disruption is both a consequence of chronic stress and a cause of worsening HPA dysfunction. We talked about eustress and hormetic stress, things that can actually help, things like Tai Chi, yoga, breath work, HRV training. My own personal preference for breathing is Ujjayi breath, which is nasal, very slow, maybe 5 or 6 breaths per minute. Of course, some people like to do box breathing protocols. I like to just present people with options and ask them to try a few things and see what resonates. That's a really good way to think about functional medicine. It's a co-creation of a journey and it's patient-centered. Of course, we always want to focus on safety, psychological safety, being sensitive with these screening tools, connecting biology back to experience, potentially addressing food trauma. I ask my clients sometimes, what was it like at the dinner table when you were 12? Right? Certain important questions that can really open doors for potential healing work. Being weight inclusive, focusing on behaviors, not BMI. As I mentioned, being collaborative rather than prescriptive, always assuming that the patient is the expert on them, and remembering that weight stigma is harmful. Food rules can trigger eating disorders, and shame perpetuates stress biology. So I'm launching a new program and a new bundle in the new year. It's called Functional Medicine for Mental Health. It's just based on the fact that mental health conditions are rooted in measurable biological dysfunction like mitochondrial, gut, nutrient, hormonal imbalances. There's so much good data with genetics and toxins. I've been doing a lot of tox burden testing to help people figure out what it is needs to be done to get into the next chapter and stand tall and look the world in the eye and feel a sense of grace and confidence. And unfortunately, some of these tests aren't covered by insurance. And that's the sad story of our healthcare system. If you want to do specialty lab testing and leave no stone unturned, I'm the guy for it. I'm able to create bundles where we look at a lot of standard labs with thyroid panels and anemia panels and everything that you could get from a standard primary care setting, and then adding functional labs like Genova's Nutraval, the GIFX, hormonal testing, food sensitivity testing. And there's, some tests out there that also include gut permeability assessments and adding genetics. My bundle of 6 tests costs $3,075. And that is a true deep dive, leaving no stone unturned. I'm a tech person, as you probably know, as an app founder, and I have built closed AI systems to simultaneously analyze some of these genetic SNPs and some of the gut bacteria and to create protocols that will change your life. It's been the most meaningful year in my career thus far because the blending of ancient wisdom, modern science, functional lab testing, and the technology we have with incredible AI insight, scouring the medical literature to essentially create protocols that are in phases. And this is what functional medicine offers. It's not, here's all your labs, here's all your supplements. It is, here is all your labs, here is what we're going to do first. And that could be just the first 6 weeks. And let's just focus on this. It does take about 6 to 7 weeks for all the different tests to come together. The cost of $3,075 is just the tests. The cost to meet with me is not included in that. I will be offering bundles in the new year, but anyone who wants to pull the trigger and get started on functional lab testing for mental health, anyone who goes within the next 48 hours, I'm going to give a special deal to free access to the Wise Mind Nutrition app. So as the results are coming in, you go through the modules and then we parse together protocols and we do steps. One step at a time, create a well-lit path. It's an overall 6-month program. It's going to be very clear price structure for 2026, but I'm offering really special deals for anyone now. So my message in a nutshell, nutrient deficiencies and associated biological consequences should always be addressed before any new psychiatric diagnoses are made. Nutrition is not alternative medicine, and that corruption in healthcare must be stopped. And so I'll meet you right there in the real world, where we combine patient preference with the scientific literature and the expertise of doing this type of work for many, many years. If you haven't checked out the Wise Mind Nutrition app, it's a great time. Like I said, there's practitioner resources and AI features that are rolling out this month. The more you use the app, the more the app will learn you and be able to customize. And as I mentioned, anyone who wants to do the bundle of lab testing and signs up in the next 48 hours will get free access to the Wise Mind Nutrition app. If you want to reach out, here are some ways to get in touch with me. Dr. David Wiss is the homepage. Nutrition and Recovery is the practice. Wise Mind Nutrition is the app. I am on social media. I am available. I am responsive, and I would love to hear from some of you.